Welcome back, everybody, to Fresh Outlook. I'm TWB. Well, from No Child Left Behind to the race to the top, policies on education reform are at the very center of this presidential election. Take a look. After weeks of bitter disputes with local officials, thousands of public school teachers in Greater Chicago have ended their strike. And while the streets of the Windy City are no longer teamed with picket signs, the political battle over education is just getting started. Nationwide, dozens of states continue to slash budgets for schools as more and more parents search for alternatives. Meanwhile, presidential hopeful Mitt Romney backs the decade-old No Child Left Behind program that many educators say has been far from a success.
We don't like the amount that they're going to do with the standardized testing. I wish people would stop thinking that standardized tests tell us anything other than the socioeconomic background of our students.
On the Democratic side, President Obama's race to the top has met similar criticism from teachers. With the election and the future of America's children at stake, education reform will no doubt be a deciding factor for many this November.
Our children's education is worth investing in. I do. And that's the choice this November.
Obviously a controversial topic. Let's get the conversation going once again and reintroduce our panelists, our fantastic all-star panelists. WJ, let's start with you. Who are you, where are you from, and why are you here?
I'm WJ O'Reilly. I'm the headmaster of the Hanal School in New Jersey, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay. Less is more, I guess.
Yes.
JBP.
I'm James Peterson, director.
JPB.
JBP.
JPB.
I'm director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University and a contributor to thegrio.com.
Terrific. And Francesca.
On the dial, FM, Francesca Maximé. I'm a news anchor here at Ebru TV and the author of Rooted.
Have you ever thought about being a radio host on the Dial FM? That'd be amazing.
Actually, I was for WNYC for a little while, the FM NPR station in New York City.
But I digress. Let's focus. Okay, let's talk about education reform. I want to start with the recent teacher strike that took place in Chicago throughout the course of September. One of the biggest labor disputes in history. Some facts to throw out there for you. 26,000 teachers walked off their jobs for the first time in 25 years, picketing over 675 schools. And remember, people who didn't know about it said, oh, it's just about money. It wasn't about money. They were faced with the prospect of the city closing dozens of failing schools, replacing them with non-unionized public charter schools, which we're going to talk about specifically in a moment. Teachers took to the street along with students as well, and new teacher evaluations as well were another point, including student performance. A lot going on.
Right.
Were they justified in striking? As educators, did you agree with the strike? What was your take on it, James?
So I try to support teachers' unions as much as possible. It's one of the foundational pieces of our public educational system. But I also have some interest in school choice and understand why school choice is needed as we're going through the process of reforming education. So yes, they had every right to strike, because I think the main thing that was important from the teachers' union perspective is how are we evaluating efficiency, how are we evaluating success in the education system, not just for students about testing, but also for teachers and about improving those test scores and improving learning for students. And so what we need, honestly, is we need much more comprehensive and much more complex forms of evaluating both teachers and students, and that was part of what they were fighting for. Tough fight for them because they had a very, very short school day, I think the shortest school day in the nation. They're a school system that actually pays their teachers fairly well. I think the average salary was about $75K. And so people unfortunately took sides based upon a little bit of misinformation. And at the end of the day, we have to come up with a better way of evaluating students and teachers in order to really have robust conversations about our public education system.
Well, both the city and the unions say it was a win for both of them. For the record, Obama never picked sides during the strike. Mitt Romney backed Mayor Emanuel. So, WJ, what do you say? What did you think of the strike? What were your thoughts on it?
Taryn, I took a triple take when you said that it wasn't about money. Because ultimately, when you're
No, it was about money, but not only about money.
Well, it was a lot about money.
Okay,
when you're talking about somebody's job, someone's livelihood, that's determined by how well their students do on high-stakes testing. For one thing, you don't get kids to do well on high-stakes tests by teaching to the test. And unfortunately, the big city school systems are doing just that more and more. If anything, they're creating more and more anxiety related to the taking of these tests, and they're doing worse and worse, and then actually, of course, they're trying to lie about it statistically. That's what happened in New York. I mean, it's not things are not improving. The politicization, if that's a word.
It is now. It is now.
It is.
I always wondered how you said that.
Of
Politicization.
education is absolutely.
And the privatization.
And the privatization are absolutely the worst things that could possibly happen to education right now.
Right.
Reform does not take place as a movement. Reform takes place one teacher and one student at a time.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how it happens. That's how
Slower process.
great things
He's
happen
right.
in education,
That's
not
right.
by people throwing lots of money. I taught at 3 of the 5 most dangerous schools in New York. We had no money. We had no books. I'd get a copy of the New York Times, and I would print up a bunch of copies of a story, and we would do vocabulary and main idea and things like that. And we were doing wonderfully with nothing.
Right.
Well, let's
but you're a
talk
great
about-
teacher, though, too.
Yeah,
You're a headmaster of
right.
the school. I mean, not
Let-
all teachers are great teachers.
Let's talk about the budget cuts.
I was
Let's-
a new teacher at the
you guys,
time. I just figured that one out.
Let's talk about the budget cuts and the privatization of schools. What, devil's advocate, what's wrong with privatization of schools? What are the big problems? I mean,
Well, I mean, I think it's the whole idea of whether or not there's real parity and equal opportunity for everyone or not. I mean, if you're going to talk about vouchers and charter schools and private schools and all of these, shifting away from being able to provide everybody with the same opportunity educationally, it's a whole other argument. Clearly, this has been not just the Republican mantra in education, but in general, whether it's business, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, the privatization, I can elect for my particular needs and whatnot, as opposed to having sort of something proffered en masse that would suit more than one person. That all being said, I was the product of private schools up until 5th grade, and then I went to Montessori. Then I went to public school from 5th grade through high school, and then I went to Harvard.
Okay.
So I'm sort of a mix of both. And I was raised in a very suburban environment outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And in my case, we had a good public school system. I think it was fair, it was fine. But
What
even
town was it, by the way?
Ashland, Massachusetts,
Ashland, sure.
near Framingham, very small,
So
area.
what were the difference? I mean, you experienced it. What
Right.
was it like?
So I think that the class size obviously is huge. Huge meaning it's large
Having
and
smaller
it's,
class sizes is better.
Right, smaller class size in a private school, more individual attention, and depending on the type of learner and the type of student that you are, you will do better in certain kinds of environments. Some kids actually learn quite well in a larger classroom size and can take that and don't need as much individuated attention. Other children really need to have their hands held a little bit more, which has nothing to do with how smart they are. So I guess what I'm getting at is to me, it really has more to do with the personality of the student than it does with necessarily the school, whether it's private or public. And the only thing is that sometimes in a smaller school setting or in a private school setting or in a charter school setting, occasionally you will get more attention paid to the students so that they can then bring that out.
Right, but again, not necessarily.
Can we talk a bit
not
about
necessarily
charter
every
schools just
student.
for the moment?
Talk
Charter
about
schools.
what? Charter,
Charter
yeah.
schools.
Yeah.
Charter schools are a very, very threatening entity in this country
Why is that,
towards public
WJ?
school systems. Because when kids elect to go to a charter school in a community, the monies that were earmarked for them by the state go with them, which means that the public school system in that town is going to be depleted by hundreds of thousands of dollars by that movement. That being said, also, charter schools are expensive to operate. The idea of having a little school with a principal making, I don't know, 100, 120K, having their own building, their own site for 100 students, how do you do that? How do you replicate that 100 times or 1,000 times?
Scale is the question.
How do you do
Does
that?
it weaken public education,
Well,
James?
so this is really a complex issue. I mean, number one, so I'm against the privatization of public education, but the reason why I support some aspects of school choice, especially school choice when it's accountable to the public, is because I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. So I grew up in a school system that essentially is a professional and academic death sentence for the students that went there. And so
What
my
town,
parents,
by the way, if I could ask?
in Newark, New Jersey.
Oh, Newark.
Newark. And so my parents could not afford for us to go to private school, and so my mom worked 3 full-time jobs to put 5 kids through Catholic school because that was really the only answer.
only option,
So in
really.
that environment, charter schools are really, really important, especially when they're not sort of outsourced and privatized. When they still have sort of public responsibility and public accountability, it's really, really important. But at the end of the day, we need to invest more in the public school system. They need more resources. And the resources aren't just for teachers' salaries, although I think I am all for paying teachers more based upon how effective a school system can or cannot be. And so charter schools are not the absolute enemy here.
I don't necessarily agree with you
James,
on
I'm gonna have to-
that.
I'm
It's
gonna-
not necessarily the teacher that's responsible for that, for the output.
James is talking about throwing more money at education that's going to solve the problem. I disagree.
Listen,
I disagree.
there are school systems that have books from 20 to 30 years ago, buildings crumbling. The part of the thing that they were fighting for in Chicago is that there's not AC in Chicago. In the summertime in Chicago, those buildings are extraordinarily hot. We actually, and it's not, you're right, it's not just monetary resources, it's actually value resources. To what extent do we value public education in this country?
All right, I'm going to play devil's
Francesca?
advocate
Okay.
because we talked about in New York there was a, not a similar strike, but there was union issues
Sure.
with the New York teachers just about a year or two ago, just like the ones in Chicago. What about some of the teachers that people will say, are sort of abusing the system or don't really push their kids forward? Or, what is a fair way to give merit and opportunity to the teachers that are doing really amazing things with the kids and sort of somehow weed out the ones that aren't?
Yeah,
It's
I
a
would
tough
love
nut
to
to
see the
crack.
teachers union just make this concession. Allow principals in their own schools to make personnel decisions. Do not force them to rehire teachers that are shuffled around through different systems, and do not force them to keep teachers there that are not effective in their perspective. Any CEO of their own corporation can make HR decisions. A principal in a public school system in the United States, for the most part, does not have the autonomy to
but
make
James-
HR decisions.
Okay, guys.
James, in New York City,
we got to
that's
wrap it up.
happening
We're
more-
going to continue this, you
Go
guys.
ahead.
Sorry, WJ, to cut you off. We're going to continue
Catch
this
you
after
later.
the break. To be continued. We're also going to talk more about education reform, specifically Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind. How do we feel? How do we not feel? We'll be back on Fresh Outlook. Stay with us. Hey, everybody. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fresh Outlook. We are in the middle of a heated debate about education reform. I mean, you should have seen what happened during the break. We got fisticuffs. We need helmets out here. We need
look
helmets.
like Romney and Obama.
I just had makeup come fix my black eye. I'm just teasing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what the Chicago strike did in terms of bringing other major issues to the forefront. Specifically, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top. The presidential candidates differ on these issues. As educators, James, let's say, can you just briefly tell us what these issues mean, what they do, and why educators are so against both of these ideas?
Well, so No Child Left Behind, grossly summarized, was a plan that essentially was a test-based program that for all failing schools were either closed or reassigned. And so it was a very high stakes. When WJ talks about high stakes testing, there were failing schools that couldn't get their students up to task, and those schools had to be closed. Right. That caused some overcrowding and essentially forced some students, and some teachers rather, to actually teach to the test. What Race to the Top does is it doesn't penalize as much, but it's still in some ways some teachers are frustrating, because what it does is those schools who get up to the federal standard then have access to more resources. So what they do is if they're testing on a certain level, or if they're improving a certain amount, so they have it's a little bit different from No Child Left Behind in the sense that you can make a certain amount of improvement and still get access to those federal funds, which if you come up with an innovative enough program for your school, you will then be rewarded with those funds. And so for teachers, those things are somewhat frustrating, because it doesn't take into account the environment in which these buildings sit. Not crime, residential challenges, nutrition challenges, all the things that really, what some educators call wraparound services, that we need to really be providing for students who are in the most challenged systems.
And the question is, though, I mean, we were talking about charter schools earlier. Can charter schools work with public schools?
It's very difficult in that public schools stand to lose great percentages of their funding when charter schools moved into the community. And there is, I think, there is some correlation between performance and individuated learning in a charter school setting, but there's a whole lot of data out there as well that shows it doesn't really make a whole lot of a difference. There's some great charter schools that are very successful, and there are a whole lot of very, very mediocre ones.
Right.
There is not a really, really hard and fast correlation to show that that particular model is successful.
I think Rhode Island had a successful model with charter schools.
Yeah,
there is precedent.
There have been some very successful charter schools. I know that one
I'm
of
not
my
disagreeing with that, but I'm saying it's, as a movement,
right.
I don't think it
no,
deserves.
well, they're
all that
taking
much.
the lifeblood out of the public school system, the money there, and then they're creating their own entity. And it's interesting too when you think about one of my girlfriends that I went to Harvard with has 3 kids, and she homeschooled them for a while, and I was surprised when she elected to do that, but she did, and then she got them back into regular school, and they had each other.
Why did she elect to homeschool them?
Well, she had moved, so she had moved to a new state, and I think that she was more comfortable. She'd left Long Island and went down to Virginia, and was more comfortable homeschooling her children there. there. But I think that she realized soon that some of the socialization aspects that were missing and some of the sort of camaraderie that was missing was necessary for her kids' overall development, and so she elected to bring them back into the regular public school.
We homeschooled our son.
Oh, really? You do? You do, or you did?
We did.
Okay.
In fact, really, I should say my wife homeschooled my son.
Oh, you didn't agree with it?
Well, of course I agreed with it. She was the real primary educator.
Oh, she physically was homeschooled. Oh, because sometimes they're online. Because my niece was online homeschooled, which was ridiculous.
Ours was online, but my wife facilitated it.
Got it.
And we did it because of an absence of school choice. We were living in inner city Philadelphia at the time. The local school was a terrible school. Sending our son there would have been essentially the end of his educational potential. And so we homeschooled, and it was fantastic for him. Gave him a great foundation. Eventually, we moved and got him into the system. But homeschooling works, especially in short bursts, like Francesca's talking about, especially around strategic moves when you first move to a place, or if you're in an area where there is no school choice. At the end of the day, we can talk all we want to talk about charter schools and everything here, but if your child doesn't have a real choice, a real option to go to a school where they can learn and be safe, then we have to allow for choice for folk who are
Yes,
in those
I got to give you
predicaments.
some background on small learning environments and the mega high schools that were created in this country. Conant, who is one of the presidents of Harvard, Conant went to my high school, Roxbury Latin School in Boston.
Great school.
Where we had 33 kids in our graduating class, and in his era, there were as few as 10 or 12.
Right.
Is his name Arthur? I forget. Anyway, President Conant, came from that kind of an environment, but he unilaterally decided that Americans' children should go to these mega high schools.
Right.
So it was completely antithetical to what he had actually been raised on himself. Now we're discovering that smaller learning environments are helpful. But Roxbury Latin is a private school, go out registrations, paying tuition and so forth. Creating these entities, these hybrid entities known as charter schools, they're creating an imbalance financially in the system. I think they do serve a certain amount of good. They need to exist, but in their form, they're just not going to, I think, survive in the long haul.
It's not the long-term answer.
No, it's
Yes.
not. What
Yes.
about the magnet schools, though? A lot of my friends that I play tennis with, for example, have kids in schools, and they're all fighting to get into the best magnet schools, the best schools in New York City, in Stuyvesant, in this and that, and Hunter, whatever it is. And it seems like, why is it that those schools end up doing so well and having that critical mass of excellent teachers and students and success rates, whereas other ones that are in the public system?
Some
I
people
just
say
wanna-
it's as simple as demographics of the parents that are raising those kids.
But it's also, magnet schools are a good amalgamation of what WJ is talking about, in the sense that they usually have themes, which charter schools have, but they also have the accountability to the public because they're still public schools. And so if you look at it, all major cities have pretty solid magnet schools. But that's not
They
the
do.
model that WJ is talking about either. There are these huge schools that are not magnet schools, that don't have themes, that essentially have large classrooms and don't speak to the needs of students in the 21st
Yes,
Okay,
Taryn.
there's a lot more to talk about. Something we didn't get to, and maybe we can think about this over the weekend. Why do mass school shootings often occur in the most affluent districts? Explain this to me. I mean, that's a whole other topic, but it's just something to consider. And we got to go to break. But email me tomorrow. Maybe we'll discuss it on Twitter or something. All right, well, from education reform to magazine reform, sort of. There might be some magazine reform taking place. One major magazine has just announced that they'll go completely digital by the end of the year. So that means you won't be able to physically buy a copy at your local newsstand. Which magazine is it? Perhaps is it one of your favorites? We'll tell you next on Fresh Outlook. Stay with us.